The remesh modifier breaks down your existing model, then recreates it using a defined method and specific parameters to recreate that object at either a higher or lower base resolution than the original mesh. To access the remesh modifier, go to the Modifiers tab in the Properties panel, click the Add Modifier button, go Generate, and from here select Remesh. This will add the remesh modifier to your existing object. Let's take a look at a relatively high poly example and recreate it with the remesh modifier. I'm going to replace this cube with Suzanne, and then I'm going to use Control and 5. This is going to add 5 levels of subdivision to Suzanne. Let's also apply the subdivision surface modifier and hit the tab key to enter edit mode, where we should be able to see just how dense the geometry is for this model. Now I'm going to add the remesh modifier to this object, and we'll see immediately that it has reconstructed the model to a much lower level of detail. The first thing to note is that we have 4 methods of recreating our geometry using the remesh modifier. The first one, which is actually at the end, is the voxel method, but we also have the ability to create our objects using blocks, using a smooth method, using a sharp method as well, and then of course voxel. So each of these is going to have a very different impact on the appearance of our objects. Let's start with the voxel method at the end, since that tends to be the default. Before we start playing about with any of these parameters, I want to make it clear that there are certain settings in Blender that you can click and drag to adjust the value. Now, if you were to click and drag on the side panel transforms, for example, this is going to be absolutely fine. But for any parameter that will rapidly adjust the geometry and level of detail for a model, it's going to force Blender to lag in terms of its performance, and in some cases, if you're not careful, it can crash Blender as well. Voxel size is one of those parameters that I have found where if you click and drag the value too far in either direction, it can crash your project in Blender. So a better method when manipulating a value such as this is to just left click to select and then type in the value that you want to preview. Now, first of all, you might ask the question when looking at voxels, what exactly is a voxel? Well, when we're using the voxel method, Blender uses a special type of file known as an open VBD file, and this is a specific format used for holding data for volumes. A voxel is effectively a 3D cube. It's almost like a sort of unique art style used in 3D modeling and beyond, where 3D cubes are combined together to create more detailed models. But for Blender to manage this process of creating and organizing these voxels into a coherent shape, it requires the use of an open VBD file to store the actual volume of that mesh in. What that means is that when we're working with the voxel size parameter, a larger voxel size actually means less voxels or fewer voxels being used on the model. This means that as we increase the value of the voxel size, you will actually see less detail on our 3D object. A lower value for the voxel size will increase the level of detail because more voxels are going to be used. For example, if we set this to 0.01 and then press enter, we actually get something that looks exactly like Suzanne. The key difference here is that this mesh is made up of many tiny little 3D cubes that have been almost merged together to form this shape. Again, we can manipulate this however we want, but keep in mind that rapidly decreasing your voxel size is going to increase the number of voxels and therefore make it more difficult for Blender to calculate. This may impact performance, create lag, or worst case scenario, crash your project. The adaptivity option, which is found below voxel size, is used to recalculate the voxels after the fact that the voxels have been created, so that geometry is reduced in areas where it is not required. Now, this can also result in triangulation of faces. So in a lot of cases with voxels, you're effectively working with quad-based geometry, but triangles will be formed when adaptivity is going to be used. Now, whereas for voxel size, you reduce the value to get more detail, with adaptivity, you increase the size here, also set to meters. So they're both set to meters for me. This might be different for you depending on your units of measurement. And this will effectively reduce the level of detail in areas where it is not required. So if there's an area of your model that has a lot of voxels, but those voxels aren't really doing much to affect the appearance of the object, then you can increase the adaptivity value to remove some of those voxels and therefore reducing the amount of geometry in that area. For example, if we select and choose a value of 0.1, you're actually immediately going to see a pretty significant difference on this model, and one of the reasons why is probably because this is a mostly smooth mesh. It's been smoothed out with the subdivision surface modifier initially, so a lot of the areas are going to require that additional geometry, and actually 0.1 is a very high value for this setting. So we can use a much lower value like 0.01. And here you can get a bit more of an impression as to what it's doing. So it looks mostly as it did before in this area of the head to the side, and also to the side here of the sort of chin and mouth area. But at the top, you can start to see these hexagonal patterns and almost like little artifacts where the geometry is being reconstructed as a result of the adaptivity setting. Now this again is going to be a case of personal preference. How much geometry do you want? What do you want your topology to be like? You would combine voxel size with adaptivity to get the ideal result, both in terms of the level of detail, but also in terms of the count or amount of geometry that you have on your object. Now, of course, if you're not that concerned with the topology of the model, which you wouldn't be in this use case, but you did want to see a nice smooth finish, then you can simply tick on the smooth shading checkbox right here. Just left click and it will enable smooth shading. But keep in mind, and you can see it right here, with certain models, you might get some artifacts appear on the smoother surfaces. Now here I could reduce the adaptivity value to 0, and that is largely going to fix that issue. And again, this is going to be dependent on the model structure. We're using a very smooth model here where we don't have many flat spaces, but sometimes you may find that combining adaptivity with smooth shading is going to yield these sorts of results where we have this artifacting on the mesh, normally on the smoother surfaces, but typically in this case we can see it almost all around the head and not so much on the face and mouth area because that's a little bit flatter. But as you can see, lots of artifacting going on here, even though we've got a relatively small value for adaptivity. Now if I increase this value to 0.08, let's see if that increases or decreases the amount of artifacting. And I would say it's probably about the same, but as you can see, it again appears all around the mesh. So keep that in mind. that when you're using the adaptivity setting, the smooth shading checkbox will shade your model nice and smooth, but it may also create those little artifacts. The other three options, which are blocks, smooth, and sharp, all use pretty much the same settings and they all work in a very similar manner. The only difference here is the sharpness parameter, which is a part of the sharp method, and that is unique to that method. For now, let's take a look at the blocks method for how our geometry is created and take a look at Octree Depth. While this is a term that is not really used anywhere else in Blender, the best way to describe this is the resolution of the mesh that is going to be created from the REMESH modifier. The higher the value here, the greater the resolution, and the greater the resolution, the greater the detail. It should be noted that as a result of this, the individual pieces of geometry that get created are going to be smaller as you increase the value of Octree Depth. Now, if I was to first of all reduce this value, as we move through the numbers very quickly, the simplicity of the model becomes apparent. 4 is considered to be a good starting point for most objects, as it will provide a very basic shape that sort of resembles that model. From there, you would then increase the Octree Depth value until you reach the resolution that best matches your model's setup and structure so that you can get as much of the detail in as possible. For all methods that you may choose to use, whether that be blocks, smooth, or sharp, the recommended values for the Octree Depth are typically going to be anywhere from 7 up to 9. Keep in mind, as we go up to 9, in the case of Suzanne here, the number of faces increases to around 500,000. Go any further than this, and you may start to get performance lag when using Blender. And we can see down here, it increases all the way up to 2 million faces for this one model, which does kind of defeat the object of the modifier in the first place. So again, the recommendation is for a value of between 7 and 9 in most cases, depending on how much detail you want on your object. The scale is used in combination with the Octree Depth parameter. So as we increase the Octree Depth, we will increase the potential highest number of vertices and faces that we can generate. And from here, we can use the scale to determine the ratio of the largest dimension of the model over the size of the grid. Now what that means is that as we increase the scale closer to 1, we practically reach the maximum resolution of the Octree Depth that we have assigned. So if I set this to a value of 1, you'll see it actually limits itself to a value of 0.99, but it will also increase the number of faces and vertices on the model. If we reduce this value to something lower, like 0.3, now you'll see that despite the fact that we have an Octree Depth of 8, we're only using 13,000 faces. So if you want to use a lower Octree Depth and then a higher scale, that's one way of generating the model. Alternatively, you could use a much higher Octree Depth, such as 9, and then you could use a lower scale value, and this will allow you to better preserve the details created by the higher resolution, whilst also not creating as many faces as you otherwise would with a higher scale value. While this is not always the case, I do find in a lot of situations that an Octree Depth of 8 to 9 and a scale of 0.5 to 0.7 tends to yield the best results without adding too many faces to the model. With the sharp method, we also have the sharpness parameter. Now, as a quick rundown, we have these two methods, smooth and sharp. Both of these methods apply smoothing to the geometry to better reform to the original shape of the objects. And you can see here, with the exception of the eyes, which was always going to be a problem for Suzanne because they are in fact different islands to the rest of the body of the mesh, the appearance of the model is very similar to what it was before we used the remesh modifier. But if we go to sharp, you should see that there's a little bit more sharpness around certain areas of the mesh. And this is perhaps not the best example because it's a very smooth object to begin with. Here we have what may be a better representation of a model that could be influenced by the sharpness parameter of the remesh modifier. Here I'm going to add my remesh modifier, and by default it's set to voxel. And voxel does like to do quite a bit of smoothing, but it also does a very good job at preserving the general shape of our object. If we move to blocks, this actually gives us a very, very accurate result because we effectively created a hard surface model that had no real curved edges. The smooth option, of course, creates a different look overall. So in this example, the smooth method for the remesh modifier would not be ideal for a hard surface mesh. The sharp option, on the other hand, is a perfect choice for an object like this edited cube, because with the sharpness value set to 1, it maintains the shape of the hard edges that go around the geometry. Now, like Suzanne before it, this is quite an extreme example because it is almost exclusively hard edge all the way around the model. As a result of this, manipulating the sharpness value doesn't actually change much on the object itself. If we compare this to Suzanne, which is mostly a smooth mesh, and manipulate the sharpness value, watch what happens to the eyes in particular. As I reduce that sharpness value, and I've got to make sure, by the way, that I've got the correct object selected, so I'm going to do exactly that. Click and drag. And eventually there's quite a bit of lag, but you'll see significant change in how the geometry is being regenerated around the eye socket here. Now, this sharpness value does not necessarily relate to the actual sharpness of the geometry. It's actually like a yes to no sort of thing, where a lower value is going to be used if you want to filter out noise. In other words, create cleaner topology as best you can. But if you want more accuracy at the result of a bit of noise, which comes in the form of potential artifacts or overlapping geometry, then you would increase the sharpness to a higher level. The remove disconnected option, located below the scale, is typically used when geometry finds itself separated from the main mesh. The remove disconnected option will remove that geometry. Now, in this example, it's not really going to do much at all to the object. There was a little bit of geometry underneath the eyes that had become disconnected from the rest, but this can be used better when in combination with a lower Octree depth or lower scale value. You end up with parts of the model that are disconnected from the main object. So for example, let's use an Octree depth of 4, and for the most part here everything looks good. It looks all one coherent mesh. So if I go remove disconnected, not much changes. Let's increase it to 5, and this time we get a little bit of geometry on each ear that is effectively disconnected from the main model. So if we left click on the remove disconnected option, it would remove that excess geometry on both ears. Now, if you didn't want to do that and you wanted to maintain that geometry, then the next best thing to do would be to increase the Octree depth as well as the scale value to try and get a more accurate result. The threshold parameter is used in combination with the Remove Disconnected tool. Here we have an Octree depth of 5 and a scale of 0.7. When we enable Remove Disconnected, most of the geometry from both ears will be removed. But if we reduce this threshold value, we are effectively going to determine or redetermine the minimum size of the components that will be removed so that we can better preserve the geometry and structure, despite the fact that we want to remove the smaller excess pieces. For example, if I set the value to 0.03, we maintain a bit more of our geometry. Not all of it. If we go and untick Remove Disconnected, you can see there's a part of the geometry that still exists, but when we tick the box, it removes it again. But if we go further still with the threshold value, and we might need to go very low, then we'll be able to bring back as much geometry as we require. That covers everything you need to know about how to use the remesh modifier and its properties. If you enjoyed this video and found it useful, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe and hit the notifications bell icon for more updates and tutorials on all things related to Blender 3D.